Hola a todos, muy buenos días a las personas que están aquí presencialmente y a los que están online. Mi nombre es Pedro Pérez, soy jefe de la sección de cuidados paliativos de la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad Católica y tengo el placer de introducir esta presentación de la doctora Agaar. Eh, Ella es médico y es especialista en medicina paliativa y ella es una investigadora destacada del centro Impact de la University of Technology y nos está visitando en el marco de un proyecto de colaboración entre la Universidad Católica y la Universidad de Sydney para la investigación en cuidados paliativos a nivel mundial y a, a abordar el tema de el aporte de investigación en cuidados paliativos, pero específicamente en pacientes con cáncer, poniendo un foco en la investigación en asociados que generan tanto malestar. Así que voy a pasar ahora a hablar en inglés para introducir a la profesora Agaar y darle la bienvenida. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Agaar to this presentation. So Dr. Agaar, she's a physician and palliative care researcher and the head of the Impact Center at Desde in Australia, Sydney, Australia. Now, this week, as part of a collaboration program between UC and UTS, she will give this presentation today about research cancer-related symptoms from the clinical context to the lab and backward. And then we'll also provide some insight into the impact at the public policy level. So, welcome, Dr. Agaar, and thank you for being here.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think as clinician researchers, we have a huge responsibility to ensure that will improve the care of patients actually reach patients, and there's do that and about our direct clinical care as the mechanism to do that. And I wanted to share today some experience we've had in Australia about how actually researchers and those in government and public policy can work together well before the research has even been done to progress care. In the context, I'm also the current chair body in Australia, and I also sit on the expert cancer control panel for Cancer Australia, which is the government body for cancer control in Australia. And I think they have been very keen to make sure supportive care experts and palliative care experts are part of the interdisciplinary panel that informs delivery of cancer care in Australia. So I'll draw on some of the experiences had in those conversations in the discussion today. So while I was preparing for this talk, really wanted to see what in the global context the dialogue was around health system change and how we actually transform cancer care. And it was really interesting reading about the Lancet on cancer systems. And I think this quote really summarises the vision of in Australia, but also that you have here in Chile, that we're really talking about a person-centred approach, and that cancer actually can position itself as one of the few diseases where we actually know how to mobilise the patient's voice, and work with community, work with patients to achieve that cross-cutting change that we really feel is necessary to improve outcomes for people with cancer. And I think that applies for survival, it applies for symptom control, and it applies for prevention. And I think this is probably the thing that can really gel all of our initiatives and really, I think, drives us as clinicians. This is the reason why we work in cancer care. And I think if we take that into our public policy and research work, we'll really be in good stead to take things forward. So on reflection, actually, the first collaborative research effort in Australia was actually built on a response to public policy. And that's, I think, a very interesting reflection in its right. And I just wanted to take you through that story because I think it might be helpful in your deliberations as you take this work forward here in Chile. So this was the policy problem. We were very interested in improving out-of-hospital care, so home care. And one of the biggest issues were that many of the medicines that we needed for good symptom control, at this time in Australia, palliative care was predominantly providing cancer palliative care. We didn't have access to those in the community setting because the way medicines are accessed in Australia in the community setting is through our subsidy program, which is the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. And a lot of the drugs we were using were out of patent. So the industry sponsor had no interest at all to put in 150 pages of application to both get their drug on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, so that's our equivalent of the FDA. And if you don't have a registration, then you can't apply for subsidy. And so essentially there were all of these drugs where patients had to pay on a private script, or there were special access schemes to import the drugs into Australia, again at great cost of the patients. And many patients were remaining in hospital purely because trying to give them these medications in the home environment was not financially viable for them. And so really it was, well, what can research do to help solve this clinical problem? So at that time, a group of clinicians in Australia worked together. They worked with the Clinical Oncology Society of Australia, which is an interdisciplinary group of professionals working in cancer care, and the Australian and New Zealand Society of Palliative Medicine. And they conducted a survey of over 200 clinicians and came up with a priority list of 25 essential medicines, where they really identified that these were critical, that subsidy of these medicines could really transform community-based care for people with advanced cancer. And this is just an example of the sort of range of medicines. And what they did is they looked at what was the level of evidence that was available. Was there actually sufficient evidence that a registration was possible? If not, how much more evidence was needed to get to that stage? And was there already a subsidy for another indication or another route where the adjustment of the subsidy indication would be much more of a simple task for an industry sponsor than starting from scratch? And so that was sufficient, and you would think that a survey of 200 clinicians, well, from a research perspective, that's interesting, but from a public policy perspective, it was the critical driver, it was the missing piece. And I think it was because those conversations between the policy people, the clinicians had a really great understanding of what the policy drivers were. They did the right research at the right time to actually triangulate that and move that forward. And they actually got a significant response from government. So government established what was called the Palliative Care Medicines Working Group. This was a partnership between the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, Medicines Australia, who are the industry representatives in Australia, the Cancer Council, Palliative Care Australia, and a group that represents healthcare consumers, which is called the Consumer Health Forum. And this group was tasked to work out the policy way forward. And And actually out of that, a new schedule was introduced into the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. At that time it was a book, and we were given the purple pages, and the pharmaceutical benefits scheme palliative care section is still to this day referred to as the purple pages, even though it's now all online. And that's publicly available, so you can actually go and have a look at the palliative care listings in the PDF. And that was achieved by working out, could those that were already subsidised have a broadening of that subsidy? Were there other drugs where they could approach an industry sponsor and actually say, you've got enough evidence to get a registration, could we work with you to progress that forward and make that easier and smoother for you? And then there was a group of 5 or 6 drugs where actually the empirical evidence was needed. But because we had this data to say these were really critical, the government actually funded a research collaborative to actually do the clinical trials to try and answer those questions. And in 2006, the Palliative Care Clinical Studies Collaborative was formed, and that was really set up to form to conduct 6 phase 3 trials of a large range of clinical indications. So we were tasked to do a trial of subcutaneous ketamine to look at its role in cancer pain, octreotide for bowel obstruction, 2 antipsychotics in delirium, opioids in breathlessness, sertraline for breathlessness, and migestrol for appetite. And all of those clinical trials were done through that collaborative work. Following that, it was expanded to develop a pharmacovigilance program to really understand real-world behaviour of some of these essential medicines. And because of the success of that collaborative approach, we were successful in 2018 to advocate to Cancer Australia that we need a 14th collaborative trial group in the Cancer Collaborative Trial Group network, and so cancer symptom trials was established. All the other trial groups were tumour-specific trial groups, including one in paediatrics. And so, in terms of the first collaborative cancer trial group anywhere in the world, really Australia was able to achieve that through demonstrating really there was a need for capacity to do clinical trials in this area. So I led one of the trials, and this was in delirium. And really this was a really important clinical question, that we see so many cancer patients with acute delirium with very distressing symptoms, and using antipsychotics had been really the mainstay of clinical practice at that time. And one of the things that I think was interesting is that when we were thinking about the essential medicines that didn't have evidence, we had to work out whether we believed an equipoise position to take a trial forward exists. And actually the evidence for antipsychotics for delirium was very poor. Whether that was in geriatrics, ICU, there was actually no definitive level 1 evidence that using antipsychotics was the right thing to do for delirium care. And we actually showed that the placebo arm did better, that we didn't see any significant difference in managing those symptoms that we routinely use antipsychotics for in terms of delirium care. It didn't pan out. And so then we had another policy challenge, because the process by which we had got to this stage was really to try and build the access to essential medicines, and we had just shown that one of the essential medicines might not have been so essential because there wasn't actually data to support the use for what the clinicians felt it was important for. And so we actually had to think about what our policy response to this new information was. As clinicians, yes, we could change our own practice, but we had to think about, given the context in which we had started this trial work in the first place, how do we respond to that in a medicine policy way? And we also knew that actually there was qualitative work, and the work that showed the voice of the patients were telling us that being mentally aware was actually really critical. physicians were not really thinking that was as important. So we knew there was a voice for our patients that also had to be taken into account. And at that time, the Australian Commission for Safety and Quality in Healthcare, which is the body that supports and provides oversight for our hospital system accreditation, was developing the first delirium clinical standard. The draft was out for consultation, and as many delirium clinical standards, that in the preface there's a big section that says this applies to all hospital patients except those with palliative care needs who are at end of life. So we actually wrote to the Commission and said, so these things that you're proposing in terms of early identification of risk, interventions to prevent delirium, patient-centered information and support, assessing and diagnosing delirium, identifying underlying causes, prevention of complications of care, avoiding antipsychotic medicines, and trying to ensure transitions back home. All of those apply. We felt our patients deserved all of these quality standards, and we thought that people with cancer deserved all of these things. And so we actually asked them to remove the exemption, which was quite an interesting policy position to say, we want to be included in your guideline, we don't want to be excluded. We don't want people with advanced cancer to be not, their clinicians not to think that this standard applied to the care that they were delivering. And to their credit, they took that on board, and we are no longer exempt. We have a revision of this standard now. We have a 2021 version, and that has allowed us to actually transform delirium care in oncology units and in palliative care units. So it probably wasn't the policy outcome we thought we were doing the trial for, but it's interesting to think about how, when we do find evidence that is maybe different to what we expect, what responsibility we take to actually take the policy response forward. And since then, we've now been working with the Palliative Care Outcomes Collaborative, which is the national quality program in palliative care, to actually include a delirium measure in their outcome assessment. So there was no delirium measure, and they had no intention of putting a delirium measure into that recording system. And this captures at least 95% of palliative care services providing care for cancer patients across the country. So it's a pretty significant data collection. And so that has really taken the policy work forward, but we would not have been able to argue the case if the delirium clinical standard didn't tell us that monitoring for delirium was what was needed in palliative care and advanced cancer care. The second example I wanted to take was the one related to opioids. And so this is an example, I think, that follows a much more traditional drug development pathway. And this, we did have industry partnerships right from the beginning, which was really important in finding the industry, the policy endpoint. So this was work led by my colleague, Professor David Currow, who worked with us in our team at that time. And what they did was, did an initial crossover study that was followed by a dose ranging and a long-term effectiveness study, and then a definitive phase 3 study. Whilst they were doing that, they also looked at Australian community data on defining the burden of chronic breathlessness, so that for the submission to the registration and subsidy processes, they actually were able to identify the magnitude of the problem. And we also had a health economics analysis in our primary trials. And so that really demonstrated that there was at least 250,000 people living with chronic breathlessness in the Australian community who might benefit. And with the industry partnership, we were able to seek support for them, if the trial was positive, to actually take the drug forward for registration, and Main Pharma to the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, and it's now registered for a breathlessness indication. There are no other countries with an opioid registration for breathlessness, despite it's something that we commonly use. And that's important because, especially for family medicine practitioners, off-label prescribing is a very scary thing to do. We feel comfortable doing that in specialist practice, but if you have people at home, cancer patients at home, and their family medicine doctor feels uncomfortable prescribing things that we think are best evidence, and opioids are one where fear and attitude prescribing is one of the biggest challenges in terms of getting good care. We have enough trouble with cancer pain. Breathlessness is even more difficult because people are not familiar with the evidence. And so a registration may seem like a simple thing for a drug that's very widely available, but it is actually quite influential when you're trying to work out how do you get this type of care to all the Australians who need it, because not everyone is going to be able to see a palliative care specialist or an oncology specialist who feels comfortable in prescribing these medicines. And it also allows for a subsidy, so people can receive this subsidised medicine. So in terms of the financial outlay for patients, it is also supported. And this really, I think, has helped us expand the program in a cancer-specific program. And the reason we wanted to expand that is because symptom issues are not only part of the end-of-life advanced cancer trajectory. I think we need to think about people's symptoms at diagnosis, and increasingly people are living with metastatic disease for longer periods of time with emerging therapies. And there's a huge number of symptoms that people experience in survivorship. Peripheral neuropathy with pain is a really good example of that. And we wanted a trial structure that could address that whole spectrum of symptom issues, not just the ones at end of life. And I think that has really helped us include a whole range of cancer professionals in our trial work going forward. This, I think, leads me to the next point, which is really around the cancer plan. And I think our cancer plan was launched in 2023. We've just discovered that was 5 years after Chile's cancer plan. And the role of interdisciplinary care, supportive care, survivorship care, and palliative care is very, very much embedded in our Australian cancer plan. And it really came very clearly through the stakeholder consultation that this was really critical. And one area that has also had focus is the needs of older people. Older people with cancer are going to be increasingly the majority of people with cancer as we face the next decades of cancer. And that's been another area of research interest that I have had. So we actually put in a submission to the cancer plan consultation, because in the initial draft, there was really no recognition that older people made up such a big proportion of the cancer population. When we spoke to the government professionals who were working on developing the plan, when we actually gave them some of the statistics from their own statistics to say, well, actually, these are the number of older people, they were really quite surprised. We actually said you need a cancer plan for older people, and if you get that right, then everyone else's care will be okay. And that was really quite a defining moment for them, because they hadn't really thought about it in that way. And we actually provided them a synthesis of the evidence. There had been some trials in the Australian context implementing comprehensive geriatric assessment in cancer care, so we were able to give them Australian data, and I think that was important. They responded very well to having Australian data, rather than to say this is what is done internationally. I think the fact it could be done in Australia really allowed them to say, well, in the 5 years and 10 years of this plan, we probably could achieve it. So it escalated our area to more of the forefront, because we demonstrated it could be achievable. And we gave them a really nice schema in terms of how could this flow through to all of the aspects that they were aiming to cover in the cancer plan. And we now have a funded grant under the Medical Research Future Fund to actually look at how do you implement geriatric screening and comprehensive geriatric assessment across 7 cancer centres in Australia, and that data will help us inform Cancer Australia in terms of implementing the Australian Cancer Plan. And this was really the 7 recommendations that we put forward to them. We put forward that the idea of respect, value and dignity for older people is important, and that we presented in the context of the literature around ageism, and that was a very evidence-based recommendation that older people with cancer do experience ageism. They're not offered treatments that other people may be offered, they're not included in clinical trials, and their needs are not thought about in terms of their broader needs as an older person. Those who are older are not often offered screening opportunities that maybe the rest of the population are offered, or they may not understand that screening still is important into older age. Supporting caregivers was something we felt was really critical for all cancer patients, but even more critical for older people. And that we needed a workforce who knew how to care for older people, and that was quite different to the skill sets that caring for someone with cancer offered. They needed some additional skills. We felt that in their advisory and governance that there needed to be some oversight, and experts outside cancer care, such as geriatricians, geriatric nurses, might be needed to help. And the structure in terms of implementing cancer care in Australia uses optimal care pathways. And so we actually proposed that the way to take this forward was to develop an optimal care pathway for older people with cancer. And less than a year after the plan was launched, we've actually been asked to develop an optimal care pathway for older people with cancer. And I'm co-leading that with Christopher Steer, who's one of the medical oncologists in Australia who has a specific interest in geriatric oncology, and he also works in a regional cancer centre, so brings quite a broad perspective around how this could be operationalised in the Australian context. And the other part was really that we needed to embed research, that older people needed to be included in clinical research, that there needed to be cancer research specifically for older people, and that was the way we needed to progress this area beyond just what we already knew, but what the plan could have as the vision for improving care for the future. So in conclusion, I think the need for evidence has been really embedded in palliative care strategy. We currently have a palliative care strategy which is from 2018. Hopefully the examples I've given give you a way of thinking about how actually if we make sure our clinical and policy questions work together so the research is informing both at the same time, you can actually get accelerated outcomes and really buy-in in terms of investment and an understanding of the return on that investment much more quickly. And I think really the science is needed for symptom control, regardless of what aspect of cancer care we're talking about. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have, because these are going to be part of the substantial challenges for cancer care into the future, and without evidence we're really going to be guessing, and it has such a big implication in terms of home-based care, people living with multimorbidity, the burden on our hospitals in terms of the number of people who are going to be coming through our door with very complex cancer situations with multimorbidity, who are older, who may have other social determinants of health. If we don't work out the symptom piece and the psychosocial and other support they need, our health systems are not going to be able to manage to provide all the other aspects of cancer care that we need. So I'll finish there, and very happy to have an ongoing conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Agaar, for this interesting presentation that highlights the connection between the clinical questions that we face in our daily work with policy regarding planning and implementing interventions for our patients, like in a more wider perspective. So what I would like to do now, it's a couple of things. First, I would like to ask you, all of you who are here and also online, like to think about at least one or two things that you think that were novel to you on what Dr. Agaar said, just to reflect a little bit on what are the topics that you think are relevant for your work, either in clinical context or in research context. That's one thing. And the second thing that I want to do now is to invite Dr. Nervi. He's the head of the CCAN Center, the Center to Promote Cancer Prevention and Research, to reflect and comment on some of the things that Dr. Agaar mentioned, and then we can have a conversation with people here and with people online. So if anyone has a question, there will be time to have discussions or conversations regarding these topics. So thank you, Bruno.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you for your presentation. So I just would like to make very simple comments to introduce a conversation, because for us it's very relevant to have the opportunity to take advantage of your experience in terms of how to see what is happening to patients and what must be faced in terms of improve their experience. And second, the relevance of research to help policymakers to make changes and to understand a little more your experience in Australia, and to share what we have been doing here in Chile. And then how to train the new generations facing the relevance of symptom care and the value of research. So how to make stable changes in the country in order to improve the experience of patients with cancer. So in the last 10 years here in our experience, first, it was very hard to be involved with the government, with the Ministry of Health, who tried to show that they were doing everything perfectly. So this was the first issue. So 6 or 7 years ago, a Ministry of Health said we are not doing very well, because apparently people with cancer is not living very good. So he said, we need your experience. And we were invited in 2018 to develop the first national cancer plan. So this, I believe, was very seminal, very relevant. And we showed the problem, and we said in Chile, 3 people die every hour because of cancer, 1 of them in a waiting list. Maybe this is not true, but this was very relevant, a statement to show the Ministry of Health and all other people that we really had a problem. Second, we need to connect experts from the scientific societies, from the universities, with the Ministry of Health and the policymakers, plus the civil society. That was really, for us at least, the most relevant pushing force to implement the changes. So I would love to know, in your experience in Australia, how relevant it is to listen patients and to push with the civil society to make changes. And then what happened was that we developed a national cancer plan to reduce the inequity in 10 years, but we had no money, we had not the supervision from the civil society. So we implemented a national cancer law. So 2018, the Gantt chart to know what to do. Then a national cancer law to try to increase the funding that we had, but we forced the presence of the civil society and the experts in a kind of audit, fuerza de auditoría, to audit that the changes, that the plan was really monitoring the implementation. And just because we had a plan and a law, that many clinicians said that, why we need a law? Why we need a regulation? Because at the end, we could say that by law, we have the same opportunity, but in reality, this is not happening. But in my experience, even if this is true, in 2018, we spent certain amount in cancer care, and we duplicate the amount that the country spent in cancer care in 2 or 3 years, just because policymakers were aware that we had a problem. But the most relevant thing, I believe, that is that we had a national cancer plan, we had a national cancer law, but the country understood that we needed information for policymakers. So the largest research grant that we have in the country was directed to researching cancer to impact public policies. So first, policymakers are aware of the problem. People is dying, suffering. We need to take care of symptoms, not at the end of the patient life, but from the beginning. So we have to show that. Then we have to show the strategy and to invite experts, the Ministry of Health and civil society, to push the real changes. And at the end, we have to show the young generations, and we have to train from the universities that this is a problem that we can make changes. So I would love to know, in your experience from Australia, is really relevant to have laws and regulations? Then what's the relevance of the civil society to make the changes, and how to train the new generations and to show that this is a very relevant problem, even more important than to incorporate very expensive drugs to increase few months the life of patients.
Yeah, I think the Australian experience is very similar. A lot of clinicians were very sceptical that, we have a national palliative care strategy, but it's just talk, motherhood statement. But unless the government gives funding, well, what's the point? It's just a bit of paper. But the fact we had that meant all the ministers across all the states had to agree on what were they going to implement. Of course, the implementation plan was quite small and the strategy was quite big, but at least they had to do something, and they had to sign their name on an implementation plan to say, this is the strategy and we're going to achieve that strategy by doing X, Y, or Z. And that was allowed us to make some progress, and it brought some funding against those implementation pieces. And I think the goal of the Australian Cancer Plan is similar, and particularly in prevention, I think both the research that is needed and the implementation of prevention strategies are particularly under-resourced, and the government doesn't quite know how to tackle cancer prevention in the same way as it has sort of mechanisms to respond to emerging treatment. So I think there's been quite a lot of focus in the Australian Cancer Plan on what research is needed to improve prevention, and particularly we have a very diverse population in Australia. Now, how do we make sure that all our prevention strategies are reaching everybody, not just people who have high health literacy? The involvement of people with lived experience, I think, was really important. I think as clinicians, we feel that if we bring the voice of the patients, that's enough. And yes, clinicians talking about patient experiences is strong, and governments do take that seriously. But if a clinician comes with a patient and the minister can hear the story from the patient, that is extremely powerful. And if you can take the voices of a group of patients, and there might be a spokesperson for them, but if they're speaking on behalf of a group of people, not just themselves, that's even more powerful. And I think that direct conversation can be really quite transformative. I think it's about trying to open that opportunity that people are willing to have that conversation, because there are a lot of barriers between governments and the community, and we can be a really strong broker to allow that conversation to happen. And I think that's been very helpful in palliative care and symptom control in Australia, and we have very vocal consumer advocates in cancer care now who are as vocal about getting access to emerging new treatments as they are about survivorship care, supportive care and palliative care. And I think the Australian Cancer Plan plays equal weight to all of those, actually, because the cancer consumers kept saying, and I was in many of these consultation meetings, so I saw this happening, that the consumers, when the medical people were getting carried away about access to this and access to that treatment, said, well, we also want access to a social worker, and we also want access to home care, and we want a survivorship clinic. Yes, of course, no, if there is a new emerging drug that will make our survival better, we want access to that as well. But they balance that quite regularly with this broader access. So I think your reflections on what has been really important in Chile is very aligned with our experience. And then I think, as a clinician, when I was training, you are very passionate about improving care for people. But I think you're trained to think the way you do that is by seeing more patients. And every patient you see, you do the best clinical care, you use the best evidence, and you improve cancer care or palliative care one patient at a time. And if only you could see more patients, if your service can see more patients, then of course you'll improve symptom control and cancer care. But there's only so much you can do, and there will always be more patients. And I think there were many people who were thinking in a different way that mentored me to think about, well, actually, if you solve the problem from up here, the battle that you have every time with each individual patient will be less of a battle. So it was a different way of thinking about it. And I think it's about speaking to clinicians to say, okay, what are you trying to achieve? The best care for the patient in front of you. Yes, we can do that by being the best clinicians, and we should be trained to be the best clinicians. But actually, we have equal responsibility to think about all of these patients as a group. And that might be particular groups. We don't have to try and tackle the whole of cancer care, but we will have a population that we particularly have responsibility for. And what are the levers we can use as expert clinicians to enhance the care for a group of people rather than battle at an individual patient? And I think talking to people about that lens, but also you need skills, you need to have some examples, you need role models, and opportunity to join in those efforts from quite early in your career, or at least be part of those conversations, even if it's just as an observer, because I think unless you see someone navigating this type of conversation, and you mentioned saying 1 in 3 people, as researchers and clinicians, we go with the research paper and we're showing the raw data with the confidence in the minister's eyes. You can see they're just like glazing over. But if you can go in and say 1 in 3, then they jump off their seat. But we're not trained as clinicians to speak in lay language, to work out what are the drivers for the government at the time. Is it hospital bed days? Is it how many people are dying? You need to do all of that detective work and then transform your statistics and your data to that language and go in quite confidently with that message. And you need training to do that. And that might be media training, public speaking training, communication training, strategic training. But I think that's really important, because if clinicians don't have those skills, you can get that meeting with the minister, and if you send the wrong clinician, they can destroy the opportunity as quickly as you created the opportunity. So I think it's really important.
Can you address this question? So who is the brain or the muscle to oversee the complete problem of the patient with cancer? So from the beginning till the end, because this is the major problem that we have, I believe, here in Chile, because the Ministry of Health is fragmented. They have a really huge fragmentations. So in Chile, we have the Ministry of Health, and from one side, people who is developing guidelines. They are in a room and they are developing guidelines. And then you have people who is just taking care of the implementation and with the problem of people and this urgency all the time. So we have people responsible for the epidemiology, other group from prevention with mammograms for breast cancer, other group for colonoscopy, other people taking care of waiting list. But there is not a brain taking care of the complete problem. So where should be this brain? In the Ministry of Health? Where is in Australia? The universities, the civil society, or there is a kind of other group taking care of the complete problem?
I think, no, in the early days, we had very similar problems, that governments silo the response to these issues, and they don't actually talk to each other, we discovered. So we would go to one government department and then the next one, and we would be telling them, oh, you know, when we spoke to your colleagues, they were saying these initiatives are happening, and they go, oh, that's very interesting. We didn't know about that. So we found we were being the messenger between the government departments. So I think we had a strategy that both we needed a group of people that were across the whole spectrum. So the prevention people need to be working with the treatment symptoms. So we needed to be seen as a strong, solid continuum, that we were talking to each other, and that it was important that we saw cancer care as this continuum and we were working together. So that was the first point, that the palliative care people are talking to the medical and radiation oncologists, who are talking to the people doing breast screening, for example, who are talking to the family medicine people. So we role modelled that that's how we think cancer care should work, and if we don't work together, the whole system will fall apart. And so that role modelling was very important. And then we went as a group to speak and advocate. So we were seen as a unified force, which means they can't tell the prevention people, oh, you're most important, but don't worry about the palliative care people. And then when the palliative care people come, they say, oh, you're the most important. We're not really, the prevention's a waste of time. So they can't do that. So that was an important strategy, I think, that we were unified and we were equally supportive of. The palliative care people were as comfortable saying, but cancer prevention is also important, and vice versa. And so that, I think, is very levelling. And then I think you've got to try and get all of these groups into the same room. And so who does that? If government's not doing that, if there's another mechanism to create roundtables or stakeholder consultations, that was the other strategy, I think, is force this conversation between these groups. And I think you have to be a bit creative, in different countries, how much you can lead that varies, and it depends of the government at the time, how they don't like roundtables sometimes because it forces these things to move forward. But I think if you can achieve that, that can be really quite powerful. And because they do silo themselves, and the skeptic in me would say they deliberately do that so that it makes the scope of what they have to respond to as small as possible. But those things, I think, have been helpful. And I think the way the Australian Cancer Plan is written, deliberately written, is to try and not give government incentive to silo these things. Of course, they'll still try to do that, but I think that's an important strategy.
So thank you, Meera. I just want to reflect that Meera has said at least 3 or 4 very deep and relevant things, and I would like to ask you to go even deeper. So I think what you said first, you said many different things. But the first thing that I want you to reflect a little bit more is on, like, what's our role. When I say our role as researchers, in terms of capturing patients' voice. I think that's something that you mentioned, like very briefly, but I think it's very powerful that our role as researchers is not just only to win a grant or to make a publication, but how to think of ourselves as an amplifier of patients' voice. Could you?
I think that's really important, and I think it's partly epidemiological, but you need to know what are the variables that are of interest. So if it is about where these people are across your country, then you need to make sure you capture your data in a way that you can tell that story. So I think you need to work out what's the story that we need to tell, and not just think about it from a research perspective, thinking about it from which patients' voices are not heard, and make sure you can find that group in your data set, because if you can't, then you won't be able to bring that to the forefront. But also, who do you need to tell that information? And they may want it in a different format. So you may think, well, to tell the patient story, I need to present it in this way, but the government always thinks about it in this way. So you need your data set to be able to do both.
So you need to think a lot about what that data is relevant, and be also flexible in the way you present your data.
And be able to pivot it quite quickly. So you need almost 5 versions of analyses, so that when you're in that meeting and they ask you that question, well, in this province, how many people with pancreatic cancer have pain? You can, if that's the topic of the month, you can, so we had a pancreatic roadmap being developed. And so we actually used the palliative care data set to work out how many people with pancreatic cancer had pain across the country to demonstrate the unmet need. But we needed to be able to say, okay, that's the policy question at the moment. We have a data set. Let's run the analysis. And so you have to be quite nimble. And then I think the qualitative work, either you bring a patient with you when you bring your epidemiology to the meeting so they can speak for themselves, or you have qualitative work that gives the story. Because I think for the majority of people in public policy and government, actually stories are stronger than sometimes the data.
So there's the opportunity to, for people in the public here or either on site to ask. I have many questions, so but if anyone has a question, there's some time, some space now. Well, meanwhile, you're thinking for your next question. Also, could you also go a little bit more deep regarding how to promote new, like, younger researchers to get involved? Like, what's our role as mentors in terms of promoting research that that captures patient experience and is able to influence, like, public policy?
I think it's about thinking about what is the clinical area that someone's passionate about. And I have a few students who are working in various areas where, I have a gastroenterologist whose interest is in liver cancer, and his interest about improving symptom care for people with liver cancer is not necessarily purely just from the quality of life symptom area, but he really is interested in the question is, if we improve people's symptoms, can we actually improve their capacity to tolerate liver cancer treatment and get them through the treatment so their survival is better, which is not necessarily the question I would be interested in as a palliative care clinician, but that's really the driver for him, and it's going to be benefit to patients, but it's a very different lens to thinking about the question. And so I think first it's harnessing what's the interest and driver of a clinician and being open that symptom questions and quality of life impact the whole of cancer outcomes, not just the symptom and quality of care outcome. It impacts family caregivers. So if you think about the economics of a country, you can even look at work productivity and know how many people are out of the workforce if someone with cancer has pain. And can we improve carer workforce participation by improving the pain of a cancer patient? That would be a completely different way. And you could be an economist to answer that question, for example. So I think first is to see what's the clinical driver and frame research that is relevant to them, and be very open to a whole broad range of questions, not only say, well, it has to be about quality of life, or it has to be about psychosocial support, and even if you want to be in the laboratory, there's so many laboratory questions people can do, I think. So, and then I think you've got to give them some examples of the pipeline, that if you do this work, it provides this opportunity and we've achieved this change. So you have to give people that whole story from a woe to go research program so they see the potential, because if you've not experienced that or seen this side of what research can achieve, it's hard to get enthusiastic about the opportunity.
And may I ask you regarding research, here in Chile, if you want to start a clinical trial and to randomize, you must pay the intervention. You have to pay for an insurance for that. So this is, we have a national regulation that obeys for that. By the other side, the Ministry of Health do not believe, or is not seeing, that the national guidelines should be built with national information from our trials. So how do you do in Australia, for example, if you want to use morphine or, I don't know, other components for pain, and you want to study that, can you do that paid by the government? So you should present a proposal to somebody in order to be financed by the government, because this is a very relevant question for the country, and you have to pay for an insurance for that or not?
Yeah, so if you're using an intervention within a trial, you have to fund the intervention. We are fortunate that we do have, I suppose, what a public interest research grant, so we can apply to a clinical trial scheme for trials which are in the public interest that an industry sponsor is never going to. There's no opioid company who's going to actually run any of these trials, not even in cancer pain anymore. I think apart from the novel breakthrough, very expensive products, no one's ever going to do a trial of morphine anymore.
If you want to try sub-Q or oral morphine,
so we would have
to randomize that.
We would have to fund that.
You have to get funding for that.
So we have the same challenge. But I think we have, at least a government perspective that Australian data is important, and they would expect an industry sponsor to provide Australian data, or at least argue the case why Australian data is not needed. And particularly for the subsidy piece, maybe not so much for the registration, but Australian data around what the alternatives are and the cost comparison, they would expect a company to do that. And so particularly around cost effectiveness, and that is particularly critical for the new oncology drugs, that they would expect a company to compare with the Australian standard of care. So companies are forced to do that. But it's very difficult for these public interest questions where there isn't an industry sponsor or a market driver for them to do that research. And I think you have to convince governments that that work is needed and why. And maybe that starts in the lab. We were talking yesterday about opioids and the work that's been done here, and is it the genomics? Do you have to actually demonstrate why there's a biological difference or why the healthcare system requires that local data? And so I think it's about thinking about what are the key differences and how you can put that case forward. But it is a challenge, I think. The other interesting thing, I think, to think about is registry trials, because I think that is a possible way where you implement the intervention in routine practice. So that might get away around the funding issue, but you set it up in a registry trial. So you structure the outcome assessment, but you use routine clinical care as your treatment arms. And so I think registry trials may be a way that make trials much more affordable for some of these public interest questions where finding funding to actually do a full-blown randomized control trial is going to be difficult.
Okay. I don't know if there is a question. La puedes hacer en inglés o en español, como tú quieras.
Thank you for your presentation, very interesting and motivated. And my question is, you mentioned about the agents, and I don't know if you can see in your research gender barriers in the community with cancer for the participation in the trials, for example.
Aging, right? And gender differences.
So I think, particularly in Australia, older people are often excluded. So a lot of the industry trials exclude older people as their exclusion criteria. And increasingly, a lot of the trial groups are trying to push back to industry sponsors and ask them why that is the case and ask them to be more inclusive. But I think sometimes older people are not even offered the trial in the first place. And so there's a lot of effort to try and improve clinicians' attitude in terms of offering an older person opportunity to participate in in a clinical trial if they might be eligible and if the study allows them to participate, and to use more robust assessments around frailty, not just, I think this person is too old and they're 80, so therefore they shouldn't be given treatment, but rather, do I have from objective assessments of frailty, doing a comprehensive geriatric assessment. Is there objective evidence that this person will not tolerate this treatment and it's not the best way forward? And I think it's a range of things. I think, again, that's where people with lived experience is really important. I think older people with cancer can speak about what's important to them, and that can be helpful in thinking about how we approach their care if we actually ask them what's important to them. We have found when we started the trial group in palliative care, even clinicians in palliative care told us you cannot do clinical trials in palliative care, full stop. They pretty much told us you're absolutely crazy. You can't do randomized control trials in palliative care. So why are you even bothering to do this ridiculous idea? We chose to ignore them and continue on anyway. And my experience is when you actually offer people choice and you explain to them, this is the question we're trying to answer. We've understood from work speaking to people like you, this is something that's important to you, and we want to try and answer which way is better to try and improve this symptom for you. People are very happy that you're interested in improving their care. They see that it's a legacy that they can contribute to knowledge to help. They know it won't help them, and they often say, I know this won't impact me and my family, but I would really love if my experience can help someone like me in the future. And I've heard so many patients tell me that, whether they're older or younger, and why should an older person not have opportunity to leave that legacy that a younger person gets opportunity to leave? And so they do it because they want to help others, actually. And it's quite different to maybe why someone joins a trial of a cancer treatment. But even in that situation, often they're joining to help others. It's just about giving people opportunity. And then if they don't want to participate, they'll tell you that quite clearly. They'll say, that's very interesting and it's great you're doing this research, but it's not for me. And that's okay as well. But we have to give people autonomy and choice and feel confident that they can speak for themselves, and present it in a way that we allow them to speak for themselves, and don't get upset if they say no, but be happy that they've been given the opportunity if they say yes.
So you're saying again that we are helping patients get a voice in what they want to do or they don't want to do. So I think you're saying the same thing in so many different ways. Like, our role as researchers is to help patients get a voice in give the patients the opportunity to share their experience, what their values are, and empower them through that process, right? Sorry.
Yeah. We are just finishing. I believe we're going to go for a coffee in a few minutes. So here in Chile, less than 5% of people gets into a clinical trial in cancer care. Mm-hmm. But in the public side, if you see what's the age of people receiving chemotherapy, for example, or surgery or radiotherapy. So I'm talking about, regarding your question, aging and opportunity in the country. In your country, 2/3 of people in chemo is older than 65. And here in Chile, apparently it's 1/3. So it's inverted. And this is because we don't give the same opportunity for everybody. We don't know where is the problem. Maybe people is not arriving in the diagnostic stage, or maybe they are the last in the waiting list for the colonoscopy, or maybe they are not receiving chemotherapy just because they are older. Mm-hmm. So this is very relevant in terms of inequity opportunity. And you want to say something?
Just to add, in the recent study that we completed regarding how cancer patients die in Chile, we found that only 30% of patients who were seen by the palliative care teams received chemotherapy. So most of the patients in Chile who are seen by the palliative care service are diagnosed with advanced cancer, and they are sent to palliative care without any opportunity to receive cancer treatment.
So here's my question. In order to listen what's relevant for patients, we need as kind of platforms. So we are trying to improve APPs in order to receive the information from patients, so PREMs and PROMs. But we don't have, this is very undeveloped in the country. So do you have platforms, of course, to receive this information for research? These are APPs. So what do you do in order to hear their experience, to measure that? Mm-hmm. Maybe you can share that with us.
So the Palliative Care Outcomes Collaborative has a symptom PROMS. It still is not entered live in most places. So it's either entered electronically within the service for use clinically, but it's not entered live into a national, so we don't have a national live database. I think we have an aspiration to get there, that the data is live both for the purposes of responding clinically, but also so that you always have a live snapshot of these kinds of prems and proms from a population level. I think there's some really good examples where proms have been used in cancer care, and in New South Wales we have a program called Prompt Care, where patients enter the Edmonton Symptom Assessment Scale and the distress thermometer in the waiting room, and that is then fed to the electronic medical record. We use Mosaic and ARIA, one of the the standard oncology medical record systems, and so that works within the oncology environment. They have developed a module where patients can enter it onto their phone, and it speaks through the firewall of the hospital, which I think took 2 years of working with the IT people who were very anxious that their firewall would have a tiny hole. But that model is working in a limited way across one health district in New South Wales. I think the challenge is to get the state governments to have a vision that to do this across broader health districts and to do it live really can improve patient care. So I think we've got some good examples and a real desire from clinicians to do that. And I think the work of Ethan Bash in the US to show that if you actually measure symptoms in cancer care treatment, you can improve outcomes just by measuring it. You don't even have to have response. You don't have to have any system to respond to them. Just by asking people and recording it in the record, there's this sequence of events that happen that improve patients' outcomes. It's very powerful data, and it's if you look at those kinds of improvements in outcomes for something which is so simple, is not a drug and won't cost us in the big scheme of things anywhere as near as some of the emerging therapies. There's so many implementation barriers, I think, even in the Australian context, but if you look at the actual outcomes that it could achieve, it's very powerful.
Well, thank you, Meera, so much for sharing your experience. I think we have so many things to learn from them, and we have also so many things to do here, trying to include patient perspective throughout the disease trajectory in developing our research projects and also in implementing public policies. So thank you so much. And thank you for all the people that are watching us on YouTube for being here too. So thank you so much, and good afternoon.